through the tunnel from the parking lot by the freeway. One moment enclosed, the next, there it is. 620 feet of water, dropping through ancient basalt into the pool below. The sound fills everything. The mist reaches you before you've taken 3 steps. And the firs, those towering Douglas firs that have been standing in this particular gorge for longer than anyone has been keeping records. They close around the falls the way a cupped hand closes around a flame. Something in your chest opens. Something that has been braced against the world releases without asking permission. A few years ago, fire tore through the Columbia River Gorge, 50,000 acres. The forest that lines the historic Columbia River Highway, those ancient firs, that particular deep green, the understory of fern and moss that makes the gorge feel like somewhere outside of ordinary time, burned. The falls were closed for months. When they reopened, people came back the way you come back to something you were afraid had changed while you were away. The falls were still falling. The mist was still rising. The firs were still standing in their particular circle around the water. The basalt still dark and wet, the way basalt has been dark and wet here for thousands of years. There's something about standing in front of something that has endured, that has outlasted fires, that keeps falling regardless, that makes the body go quiet in a particular way. Reverence, maybe. Gratitude. The specific humility of being very small in front of something so very old. There is a legend that lives here. They say that sometimes, if you look up into the mist, into the place where the water first becomes air, you can see her, a figure suspended in breath before the leap. This is a Wasco legend. I want to hold it carefully and tell it as close to what it is as I am able. Many years ago, the head chief of the Multnomah people had a beautiful young daughter. She was especially dear to him, as he had lost all his sons in fighting. He was now an old man. He chose her husband with great care, a young chief from the neighboring Clatsop people. The wedding feast lasted several days. There were canoe races and archery contests, dancing and feasting. People came from tribes along the lower Columbia to celebrate the two people they loved. Then, without warning, a sickness came over the village. Children first, then the young and the strong, one by one. The chief called his elders and warriors for counsel. The oldest medicine man who had come down from his mountain home when the chief sent for him rose and spoke. He told them of a prophecy his father had told him when he was young, that a time would come when a plague would fall upon the people. There would be no survivors unless an innocent daughter willingly gave her life to the Great Spirit. The chief refused. He would not ask this of anyone. He told his warriors, "Tell our people to meet death bravely. The meeting has ended." More people died. The chief's daughter sometimes wondered if she should be the one, but she loved the young warrior. She wanted to live. A few days later, she saw the sickness on his face. Now she knew what she must do. She cooled his hot face. She cared for him tenderly. She left a bowl of water by his bedside. And then she slipped away alone without a word to anyone. All night and all the next day she followed the trail to the great river. At sunset she reached the edge of the cliff. She stood there in silence looking down at the rocks far below. She called for Great Spirit, asking for a sign that her sacrifice would be accepted, that it would end this sickness. She looked to the sky. The moon rose above the trees. She closed her eyes. The next morning, the sickness lifted. When the people realized she was missing, the young warrior, recovered now, saved by what she had done, raced to the cliff. He found her on the rocks below. They buried her. Her father went to the water's edge and prayed to the Great Spirit, "Show us some sign that my daughter has been welcomed into the land of the spirits." Almost at once, they heard the sound of water above. A stream of water, silvery white, began coming over the edge of the rock. It broke into floating mist and fell at their feet. She is still there in the mist, not haunting, arriving, not trapped, but held. The waterfall is the answer to a father's grief. The spirit world said, yes, she arrived, she's here, she's welcomed. I want to sit with that before we go anywhere else. She wanted to live. The legend holds that. It doesn't smooth it over. She loved him and she wanted to stay, and she chose anyway. And when she did, her father stood at the water's edge and asked the spirit world, did she arrive? Did you accept her? And the world answered, she was witnessed, she was received, she was held completely for exactly who she was and what she chose. Even the choosing was held intact. She overruled her father. She slipped away in the night. She left a bowl of water by the bedside of the man she loved, and she walked to the edge of a cliff alone. That is not a passive sacrifice. That is an act of will, so complete it became a waterfall. I find this story profoundly beautiful. I always have. And I am aware, standing here, preparing to use this legend as the opening of an episode about women whose stories were taken from them, that I am also standing at a waterfall that isn't mine. This is a Wasco story. It belongs to the Multnomah people and the tribes of the Lower Columbia. I am not a member of that community. I grew up with this legend, but I came to it as someone from outside who found it beautiful and kept returning. That is worth naming, not as a disclaimer, just an honest reckoning. Because what I'm about to do is use this legend as a threshold, a place to stand before I walk into the story of women from my own tradition, women whose stories were authored by others, women who were not witnessed the way she was witnessed, women who were not received. I'm not here to explain what this legend means. That is not mine to do. What I am doing is standing at the edge of it, feeling what I feel, and following that feeling into territory I actually have the standing to examine. The falls open the door, but what I carry through it is my own. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot stop thinking about, is what it looked like when a community held a woman so completely. What it looked like when someone stood at the water's edge and asked, did she arrive? And received an answer. Because the other women I want to talk about today were never asked that question. No one stood at the edge of their lives and asked the world for a sign. No one waited for an answer. In the 1830s in Berlin, where my mother grew up, and where I spent a lot of time as a child, 3 women were held up as ideals by the movement known as the Young Germans, the romantic literary circle that shaped German intellectual life for the years before the Revolution of 1848. The 3 women were Bettina von Arnim, Rahel Varnhagen, and Charlotte Stieglitz. They were celebrated as muses, models of femininity, examples of what a woman of culture and feeling was supposed to be. what the young Germans needed from them, and what those women actually were not the same thing. Bettina. Bettina von Arnim refused to disappear. When her husband died, she was widowed in her late 30s. She became more, not less, more political, more prolific, more present. She took her years of correspondence with Goethe, the most celebrated German writer of the era, embellished them liberally, shaped them into the narrative she wanted, and published them under her own name. The culture called her eccentric, difficult, too much. The word was never brilliant. It was always something that kept her just slightly outside of the room where brilliance was officially recognized and most often belonged to males. But she kept her hands in her own story. In this company, that is remarkable. That is, in some ways, an act of survival. Rahel. Rahel Farnhagen built a salon, a Jewish woman in early 19th century Berlin, without inherited wealth or conventional beauty, created one of the most significant intellectual gathering places in the city. Goethe came, Hegel came, the poets and philosophers came because Rahel's mind was worth being in the presence of. She also wrote thousands of letters considered among the most important prose of the German Romantic era, and she fought. Every day, in ways large and small, she fought against a world that kept offering her only two acceptable shapes: invisible or decorative. Decades after her death, Hannah Arendt wrote her biography. She tried to write it as Rahel would have written it herself, an act of extraordinary care. But even the most careful act of recovery involves someone else's hand. Rahel was never completely accepted. She was never not fighting. Charlotte Stieglitz wrote, not for publication. She was not considered a writer, not officially, but her posthumously published letters and journal excerpts and poems mark her even now as a skilled stylist. She had the gift. She simply had no sanctioned place to put it. She was 28 years old. She had been married for 6 years to a poet named Heinrich Stieglitz, a man of early promise whose creative powers had, by the mid-1830s, quietly stalled. Her journals from this period show someone straining against her circumstances, highly intelligent, frustrated by her limitations, depressed, aware of her own capacities in a life that had no use for them. Not a woman at peace, a woman in a too small room who knew the room was too small. On the night of December 29th, 1834, Charlotte sent Heinrich to a concert. She wanted to be alone. She washed. She dressed in a clean white nightgown and placed a white cap on her head. She went to bed, and she stabbed herself in the heart with a dagger she had given Heinrich as a gift when she was his bride. In her farewell note, Charlotte wrote that her death was an act of self-sacrifice, that the pain of losing her would break Heinrich free from his lethargy, liberate his petrified poetic powers, restore him to his genius. Her death was framed as a gift to his creativity. In that suicide note, she wrote her own erasure into the last words she ever put on paper. Heinrich lived for 15 more years. He is buried beside her now. The historical record is not generous in its assessment of what his poetry became after her death. After she died, 2 men wrote the book that would define how the world would remember her. One was Theodor Mundt, a writer and a friend, and a man who had been in love with her. The other was Heinrich himself. They called it a memorial. Heinrich had read her journals. He knew what was in them, the frustration, the depression, the sense of a mind with nowhere to go. He sat down and wrote his version of the memorial anyway. Not the Charlotte who wrote, the Charlotte who died beautifully. I've spent a long time with Charlotte, years in another life, reading and studying her journals, sitting in frustration with them, knowing that she was so much more than the peaches and cream beauty that was most often the highest praise the men in her life gave her. And I want to say something plainly, something that the legend of the perfect muse sacrifice does not say. She was not trying to inspire mediocre poetry. She was trying to end her own suffering in the only language her world had given her, the language of offering, of usefulness, of a woman's life made meaningful by what it provides to someone else. She could not simply leave. She could not say, "This life, it's too small for me," and mean it as something other than failure. She could not publish her journals and walk out the door. So she wrote the note that made her death mean something to him. Even her departure was performed for his comfort. Even the dagger had first been a gift to him. Charlotte Stieglitz was the most idealized of the three muses of the young Germans. Charlotte Stieglitz left the least trace of her actual self. These two facts are not unrelated. There is a novel that has been living in my mind for a long time alongside Charlotte. J.M. Coetzee's Foe. It is a retelling of Robinson Crusoe, told from the point of view of a woman named Susan Barton, who was also on the island, who was also there, whose story was never told. Susan survived. She had a story. She went to a writer named Foe and asked him to tell it. And Foe, gently, professionally, with the full authority of someone who understands how stories are supposed to be shaped, told her how her story should go, what it needed, what the market would hold, what a reader would recognize. Her story in his hands became something she no longer recognized as hers. And then there's Friday, the man, a slave whose tongue has been cut out, who cannot tell his own story under any circumstances, who is present in the novel as a body that everyone, Susan included, writes meaning onto. Susan has more power than Friday to shape the narrative, but she has less power than Foe. And Foe has less power than the tradition that decides what stories are worth telling and how they must be told to be worth hearing. The power moves in layers. It always moves in layers. Charlotte's story moved through Heinrich, then through Mundt, who loved her, then through the literary tradition that needed a perfect muse death more than it needed a frustrated woman's journals. Susan Barton's story moved through Foe, then through the publishing tradition, then through Defoe himself, who was somewhere behind everything, the original author, the one whose name we all actually know. Friday's story never moved at all. It stayed in his body, with nowhere to go. This is not a coincidence. It's a structure. In the 1870s and 1880s, at Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, a neurologist named Jean-Martin Charcot was making his reputation. Every Tuesday he held lectures, women diagnosed with hysteria, a diagnosis that meant essentially, "We don't know what's wrong with you. We're not entirely sure we believe you anyway." Were brought before an audience of male physicians and students. They were asked to perform their symptoms. They were photographed. Their bodies became the text of his lectures. Their suffering became his scientific legacy. The Women of Salpêtrière were not just authored by Charcot. They were staged by him. Their pain was theater. Their bodies were evidence for conclusions he had already reached. We know some of their names now because researchers went looking. Blanche Whitman, Augustine, Geneviève. At the time, they were cases, illustrations, proof. Freud studied under Charcot before he opened his own practice. He learned in those Paris lecture halls that women's minds and women's bodies were available for interpretation by men with the authority to name what they meant. He brought that lesson to Vienna. He brought it to a young woman he called Dora. Her name was Ida Bauer. She was 18 years old. She had been referred to Freud by her father, a man who was having an affair with the wife of a family friend, and who had, it appeared, offered his own daughter to that family friend as a kind of arrangement. Ida came to Freud and tried to tell him what had happened. Freud listened. And then he told her what her symptoms really meant. He interpreted her revulsion as desire, her anger as repression, her entirely reasonable response to an entirely unreasonable situation as evidence of her own pathology. She terminated treatment and walked out. Think about what cure would have looked like in that consulting room. Cure would have meant accepting Sigmund Freud's interpretation, conforming to the story he had already written about what her body and her mind were really doing. Cure would have meant becoming legible to the system that had already decided what she was. There is a word we used in an earlier episode for what happens when a woman refuses to become what the system needs her to be. They called Anna Marple a witch because she screamed at the scaffold and refused to be a sympathetic figure. They called Ida Bauer hysterical because she said she had been wronged and refused to be cured of saying so. The inquisitor and the analyst are separated by 3 centuries, but their verdict is the same. The woman is the problem. Freud published his case study anyway, after she terminated treatment, essentially without her consent. He named her Dora, a name not her own. He gave her a diagnosis she had refused. He made her the illustration of a theory she had tried to walk away from. Ida Bauer went on to live a full life. She married. She had a son. She fled Vienna when the Nazis came to power. She died in Paris in 1945. What Freud published is what most people know of her. She became his case study. He became her author. From Stieglitz and Mundt's memorial to Charlotte, to Charcot's lecture theater, to Freud's consulting room, the tradition moves without interruption. Different centuries, different vocabularies, same act. The woman at Multnomah Falls chose and was received. Bettina chose and was tolerated. Rahel fought and was partially held. Charlotte wrote the note that made her death a gift to someone else's story, and was published after her death by the people who needed her to mean something. The fictional Susan Barton survived and had her story shaped by someone who knew better what a story should be. Ida Bauer walked out of a consulting room and had her walking out turned into a case study about her own repression. The women of Salpêtrière performed their suffering in a lecture hall and were photographed. The choosing and the not choosing, the surviving and the dying, the writing and the silence, all of it, in the hands of those with more authority to shape the narrative, became something other than what the women themselves might have made of it. What made the difference at the falls was not the sacrifice. It was the witnessing. The father who stood at the water's edge and asked, "Did she arrive?" The spirit world that answered, the community that held her completely for who she was, not for who they needed her to be. That is what was missing. Not agency. Bettina had agency. Not beauty. Charlotte had beauty. Not brilliance. Rachel had brilliance. Not survival. Susan Barton and Ida Bauer both survived. Witnessing, the kind that says, "I see you, all of you, not just the parts I can use." The vocabulary keeps changing. Memorial, case study, testimony, file. The women keep coming forward in groups because one has never been enough. The stories keep being managed, interpreted, doubted, or simply buried by those with more power to shape what gets told and how. This is not a pattern that ended in the 19th century. It is not even primarily a historical problem. It is present tense, which is why the stories matter, which is why we tell them, which is why we insist on saying their names and asking what they felt, not what they meant to the people around them, but what they felt. We are all, in some way, standing at a waterfall that isn't ours, moved by a story we didn't author, carrying something that was handed to us already shaped by someone else's hands. The question is not whether we stand there. We do. We always have. The old stories travel. They find us. They move through us whether we invited them or not. The question is what we do when we feel the mist on our face and realize we are holding something that deserves to be held carefully. Do we ask whose it is? Do we ask what it cost? The person it came from? Do we stand at the edge and say, "I see you, all of you, not just the parts I can use"? I will go back to Multnomah Falls. I always go back. It's one of my favorite places. It's one of those places that feels like home. The beauty is intact. The love I have for this place is intact. But it is held differently now, with more awareness of what it asks, more tenderness for the woman in the mist, more gratitude for a tradition that knew how to hold a woman completely. A tradition that asked, "Did she arrive?" and waited for the answer. What did she feel like in that moment at the edge of the cliff? Not the sacrifice, not the legend, her, the person, in the breath between the life she was leaving and the waterfall she was about to become. She had cooled his face. She had left water by his bedside. She had looked at the moon. We can't know what else she felt. We can't know. But we can ask. And asking, insisting on her interiority, her personhood, her felt experience in that moment, that is its own small act of witnessing, even from a waterfall that isn't ours. The spirit world answered her father's grief with a waterfall. I don't know what answers the grief of the women who wrote in private and were published by others, who walked out of consulting rooms and had their walking out turned into diagnosis, who performed their suffering in lecture halls and were catalogued, who straightened the blankets because even dying they were performing for someone. Maybe this is part of it, saying their names, holding their complexity without soothing it into usefulness, asking what they felt, not what they meant to the people around them, but what they felt. Charlotte Stieglitz felt frustrated. She wrote it down, in private, in her journals that survived her because someone else decided to publish them. That matters. Rachel Farnhagen felt other, profoundly, persistently, exhaustingly other, and wrote thousands of letters about it that are still read today. That matters. Bettina von Arnim felt constrained and published her way out of it, and lived long enough to become something the culture hadn't prepared a category for. That matters. Ida Bauer felt that what had happened to her was real and wrong and worth saying. She said it. She walked out. That matters. And the woman in the mist, whose name I don't know, whose tradition is not mine, whose waterfall I keep returning to anyway, she felt something in that moment at the edge of the cliff, something the legend holds without explaining. That is the right way to hold it. I'm Martina Rutledge. This is Breath and Bone, where the old stories live.